Hey everybody, it's Mr. Drake. Today's video is about the French and Indian War. We'll talk a little bit about French colonization of North America, whereas up to this point we've focused primarily on the British. We'll also talk about the war itself and its impact on the relationship between Great Britain and the colonists in North America. So with that, let's go ahead and start. The French began colonizing North America right after the British did. As you see, their first colonization was at Quebec in 1608, which is 1 year after Jamestown. Immediately, they formed an alliance with a Native American tribe called the Huron. And if you've heard of Lake Huron, you know where that is, one of the Great Lakes, so generally kind of in that region. And the Huron at the time were fighting a war against a major Native American tribe in the Northeast called the Iroquois. The French and the Hurons entered into an alliance in that war. And from that point forward, the Iroquois really hated the French. And so this is looking on ahead, but the Iroquois are really the only Native American tribe to support the British in the French-Indian War. 150 years later, I guess they could hold a grudge. So some of the things the French were good at, their colonization looked a little bit different than the British did. They did a lot more exploring inland than the British did. The British colonies early on especially tended to stay closer to the coasts. The French explored the interior, and in fact went all the way to the Mississippi River, what we now call Mississippi River, and sailed all the way south and found what we would now call New Orleans, and they named that Louisiana after King Louis, right? So they were very well learned, very educated, and did a lot of early mapping of the interior of North America that spread back to Europe. Also very good at fur trapping. European high fashion of the time dictated that women wear fancy, awesome, furry hats. You see a picture of one there on the slide. And as a result, they killed a lot of beavers for the pelts. And while that may have been good for the milliner trade in Europe, it was not great for the environment, unintentionally causing some flooding as there were no beavers around to build dams anymore in some places. They also cared a lot more about proselytizing to the natives than the British did. And so a lot of the leaders of French expeditions were Jesuit priests who were missionaries and preached to the natives as well. So that's kind of the 30,000 foot view of French colonization of North America. So what were some of the causes of the war between the British and the French? For a long time, the British and the French more or less coexisted peacefully in North America. But there was one area here, the Ohio Valley, you see on this map, that was sort of claimed by both. And in the 1750s, there was a charter established something called the Ohio Company, where the British were sent basically to colonize the Ohio Valley, and the French were sore because they thought they controlled that land. So the conflict was that the British wanted to expand. They wanted to go beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The French wanted to connect the territories they already had. They pretty much undisputedly had the area around what we now call again the Louisiana Territory and all of that here by the Mississippi River. They had a lot of this area up here, what we would now call Quebec, which is of course the French-speaking part of Canada. But it was a little bit incontiguous, and so they wanted to sort of connect this area as well. And so both began building forts in the area, and there's this big sort of arms race between the British and the French, culminating in the first battles in 1754. The linchpin of military control in the region that both sides wanted was called Fort Duquesne, which was located right in what we would now call Pittsburgh. If you've actually ever heard of Duquesne University, it's a university in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And if you know anything about Pittsburgh's geography, it is the location where three rivers converge: the Ohio River, the Monongahela River, and the Allegheny River. And so as a result, it's very important strategically for trade, for military strategy, and all of that. And so whoever controlled that fort would definitely have an upper hand. So it became a big prize for both sides to try to get. So the war actually begins in 1754. The first shots are fired near Fort Duquesne. The 22-year-old British Army colonel named George Washington. Yes, that George Washington. He initially wins in a skirmish against the French and very hastily builds a new fort called Fort Necessity. And the French regroup after a short period of time, come back and defeat him. And he was actually nearly killed in that battle as he and his men were forced to surrender. So George Washington's military career actually began kind of on a bad note. But anyway, this leads to full-scale war between the French and their Native American allies and the British and their colonists and their Native American allies, the Iroquois. One of the biggest problems that the colonies had, and the British had, as of 1754, is that all of the colonies were pretty much autonomous and independent. They didn't have really any common thread connecting them other than they were British. And so some colonial leaders try to rectify that and unify for the war effort by creating something called the Albany Plan. And the goal was to create a loose union of the 13 colonies to assist with military defense. This was done because it was seen as being necessary, basically, combine your forces so that you're stronger. They also wanted to appease the Iroquois, who wanted to help the British, but also thought the British were being a little bit hapless and were disadvantaged by not being unified. So this plan is proposed. It doesn't really go anywhere. It was an unpopular idea everywhere in the colonies and in Britain, so it never really gets off the ground. Ironically, it's unpopular in those places for opposite reasons. The British thought that it gave the colonies too much independence, and the colonies thought it didn't give them enough independence. But either way, it doesn't go anywhere. But that idea of the colonies needing to unify can be sort of traced to 1754 and the Albany Plan. And you see there that picture of the cartoon, the famous Join or Die cartoon, which was actually drawn by Benjamin Franklin. And I think a lot of people tie that to the American Revolution, but it was actually drawn in 1754 in support of the Albany Plan. So the British continued to do pretty badly. They lost Fort Necessity. They tried to capture Fort Duquesne. The British send this crackerjack general of theirs, one of the most famous British generals of his time, Edward Braddock, from Virginia to, actually I think they started in Maryland, and then they went to Pennsylvania to try to capture Fort Duquesne back, along with several other British forts. They fail. Braddock ends up getting killed. Things go really badly for a while for the British. It gets so bad, in fact, and the British colonists were so uninterested in fighting this war that they had to start offering bounties to the colonists to participate. And the colonists, the bounties rather, were scalps. Basically, if you killed an Indian and scalped him, you received a certain amount of money. And that was how they tried to motivate the colonists to fight. It worked for a while, not for terribly long. The British also tried to invade Canada and the West Indies in 1756. This largely fails. The British did manage to dislodge the French from Nova Scotia in far northeast, like Atlantic Canada. And the French who were living there got, the best word for it is deported. And they were called Acadians. The people who lived in that area in Nova Scotia were called Acadians, and they were French speaking. And a lot of them ended up settling in Louisiana, which continued to be controlled by the French for a time. And there they became known as Cajuns, sort of like a alteration of the Acadian term. If you ever wondered how the French speaking people ended up in Louisiana, there you go. Random aside, this is a picture of me out on a run in Gaithersburg, Maryland one day where my sister-in-law lived, and I found this historical marker showing where Edward Braddock actually gathered his people to go recapture Fort Duquesne. And I was like, no, don't do it. You're going to literally get killed. But I couldn't go back in time and warn him. So anyway, I saw that and was like, my APUSH, nerd alarm went off in my brain. And so I took a selfie with it. All right. Eventually, the tide turns in the war. The new British Prime Minister, William Pitt, as in Pittsburgh, decided to basically forget the Caribbean. They thought that maybe the British were spreading themselves too thin and biting off more than they could chew by trying to take over everything all at once. And so they focused on recapturing Canada instead of like spending a bunch of resources trying to, hold Caribbean islands and all of that. And it mostly worked. And we're not going to talk about specific battles or anything like that. Nothing you need to know for APUSH really there. But the fighting was mostly over in North America by 1760 with the French predominantly subdued. Problem is that the French-Indian War ultimately ends up becoming part of this larger 7 Years' War that was occurring in mostly Europe between the British, the French, and the Spanish. And so they have to kind of just cool their heels for 3 years waiting for that war to end and for all of these, shifts in possession of land to be settled by a treaty. And the Treaty of Paris is finally signed in 1763. The big impact of that is that the French are kicked off of the North American continent. They lose all of their territory. You might remember from that map earlier, they controlled it. I'll just go back to it for a second. They controlled all of this up here in New France, all the way down to Louisiana, and then that changes, and essentially the British control everything east of the Mississippi River. The Spanish took over what the French controlled west of the Mississippi. Again, the Spanish weren't really involved in the French and Indian War, but they were involved in the 7 Years' War, so they got a piece in that peace settlement. So, war's over, and that means the French are gone, and the Indians are largely subdued in the Ohio Valley, and so British settlers start going into the Ohio Valley. And the Indians did not like that at all, the ones that remained. And this culminates in several revolts against the incursion on their land by the British. Biggest one being Pontiac's Rebellion, which takes place in modern-day Michigan in the fall of 1763, where the British Army basically had to come bail out some settlers who had found themselves in this battle or low-level war with Native Americans. And so, reeling in debt from the 7 Years' War, the British knew they couldn't afford to have to go defend colonists all the time. So they end up passing a proclamation in 1763 that is very creatively called the Proclamation of 1763. And in that, they basically drew a line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and said there can be no more British settlement past this line. It wasn't very easily enforceable. The British, they couldn't afford to defend against Indian attacks, so that means they also couldn't just put outposts along the mountains to stop people from going by. It's not like they could put up, toll booths or checkpoints or whatever. But the colonists were still really angry. They were like, we helped the British defeat the French. We paid for this land with literally our own blood. Like, why can't we go settle it? And so this resentment begins to sort of plant itself. That at the beginning of the French-Indian War, as of 1754, I think the vast majority of American colonists in North America they saw themselves as British, and they do still for a while leading up to the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution and all of that. But you start to see that dam break a little bit, and the British being in debt is also going to lead to the British starting to enforce taxation on the colonists and saying, well, we fought this war mostly to defend them. They should have to pay for their own defense or at least help. And so this conflict begins. And so, the Proclamation of 1763 and the end of the war sort of begins this ball rolling towards independence and revolution a decade later. That's all for today. Feel free to put some questions in the comments, or if you're one of my students, put any questions on Classroom or shoot me an email or whatever. Hope everyone learned something, and talk to you soon. Cheers.